Coming up today, the rift is deepening between the pro-Park and non-Park factions of South Korea's ruling party. The two sides are fighting over candidate nominations for next month's general election. US President Barack Obama issues an executive order imposing new sanctions on North Korea in response to its illicit nuclear and missile tests. Plus, the US Federal Reserve stands pat on interest rates and halves the number of possible rate hikes this year to 2 amid concerns about the global economy. Stay tuned for these stories and more. Hello, it's noon on Thursday, the 17th of March. You're tuned in to our midday newscast here on Arirang TV. Thank you for joining us. I'm Mark Broom. The countdown to next month's general election is our starting point this afternoon, and internal divisions are threatening Korea's political parties as they prepare for that upcoming election. At the ruling Saenuri Party, the so-called non-Park faction has criticised the nomination process as unfair. Most lawmakers loyal to President Park Geun-hye have been given the go-ahead to run in the April 13th election without primaries, while non-Park members have been left out. Party chairman Kim Moo-sung boycotted a Supreme Council meeting today in protest after the nomination committee, controlled by Park loyalists, refused to consider his request to reconsider. Now, over on the opposition side, Kim Han-gil, a senior member of the minor opposition People's Party, announced Thursday that he will not run in the election to take responsibility for failing to unite the Liberal bloc. Kim and co-leader Ahn Cheol-soo have been at loggerheads over a proposed merger with the main opposition Minju Party of Korea. The United States has slapped tough new sanctions on North Korea in response to the regime's recent nuclear and ballistic missile tests. The White House emphasized that the sanctions target the leadership, not the North Korean people. Park Ji-won reports.
U.S. President Barack Obama has signed an executive order hitting North Korea with a fresh set of sanctions in response to the North's January nuclear test and February missile launch. The White House said in a statement the executive order enables the U.S. to implement the latest UN Security Council resolution and a set of recently enacted U.S. sanctions against Pyongyang. The White House statement went on to say that the U.S. and the global community will not tolerate North Korea's illicit nuclear and ballistic missile activities and will continue to pressure North Korea until it comes into compliance with its international obligations. The new sanctions aim to cut off the Kim Jong-un regime's financial resources, including a new measure prohibiting the North's exportation of workers, which constitute a significant part of the regime's revenue. The sanctions especially target North Koreans working in the mining, energy, and banking industries who contribute to the North's nuclear and missile programs, as well as those engaged in cyber terrorism and those who contribute to the North's human rights violations. The sanctions also target the propaganda and agitation department of the North's ruling Workers' Party for the first time. With the sanctions going into effect, the U.S. Treasury Department has blacklisted 2 more individuals, 15 entities, and 20 vessels that have done business with North Korea. Park Ji-won, Arirang News.
Now, in a sign the UN sanctions slapped on North Korea are already working, Russia's biggest energy company has decided to stop doing business with the regime. Citing Russian media reports, Radio Free Asia reported Wednesday that Gazprom said it is suspending business with North Korea in a memorandum of understanding regarding its plan to issue new Eurobonds. Gazprom said any business links with North Korea could subject it to international sanctions, and added that it is not doing any energy-related business with the North at this time. The Russian energy company had been pursuing oil exploration and mining businesses with Pyongyang. North Korean ships that had disappeared from radar after the UN sanctions were imposed on the regime have reappeared at Nampo port in the north-south Pyongan province. Voice of America reported Thursday, citing analysis by Marine Traffic, which tracks the positions of vessels around the world, that 29 North Korean ships have just reappeared on radar and are now docked in the harbour. The VOA report says most North Korean vessels had turned off their automatic identification systems soon after the sanctions were imposed and, for some reason, turned them back on. The US government has urged North Korea to promptly release a young American college student who was recently sentenced to 15 years of hard labour for trying to steal a propaganda sign from a hotel in Pyongyang. White House Press Secretary Josh Earnest issued the appeal on Wednesday, but he accused North Korea of using detained Americans like Otto Warmbier as pawns to pursue a political agenda. He said the US wants the North Korean government to pardon Mr. Warmbier, grant him special amnesty and release him immediately. The White House says the offence of which he was found guilty of would not warrant an arrest and imprisonment in just about any other country in the world. Ernest also stressed that the US government has no greater priority than the welfare and safety of Americans overseas. Now, a dovish Federal Reserve has kept its key interest rates steady after a two-day meeting in Washington. It said the continued modest pace of economic expansion would accommodate further rate hikes in the future, but Fed officials have reduced the number of increases for this year. Kim Min-ji reports.
The U.S. Federal Reserve stayed pat, leaving its rate unchanged in light of uncertainty stemming from the global economy.
The committee decided to maintain its target range for the federal funds rate. This decision partly reflects the implications for the U.S. economy of the global economic and financial developments.
That means the current interest rate target of 0.25 to 0.5% will stay the same for now. Rates had been at near zero before the Fed decided to raise rates in December last year by 0.25%, marking the first hike in almost a decade. The Fed also revised down its growth forecast for the U.S. economy to 2.2% this year, down from its previous projection of 2.4%. The outlook for inflation was also cut to 1.2% by the year's end, down from a prior 1.6% call due to the prolonged effects of falling energy prices. But the Fed wasn't totally pessimistic about the U.S. economy.
Growth is expected to run somewhat in excess of potential, and with a continuing improvement in the labor market, I think we'll see upward pressure on inflation.
While the Fed said moderate economic expansion and continued job growth would accommodate rate hikes down the line, Fed officials are now calling for 2 hikes this year, down from the previously envisioned 4. On the dovish approach, Wall Street posted gains on Wednesday. The Dow Jones Industrial Average closed up more than 0.4%, while the S&P 500 added more than 0.5%, reaching a 2016 high. The tech-heavy Nasdaq rose over 0.7%. Kim Min-ji, Arirang News.
And the price of West Texas Intermediate rallied more than 5.8% on Wednesday, hitting almost $38.5 a barrel. The spike was helped by a decision by OPEC and non-OPEC leaders to proceed with a meeting to discuss a global production freeze with or without Iran in April. It was also bolstered by news that US inventory levels grew last week at a smaller rate than expected. WTI is now up 48% from its 2016 low. Brent crude ticked up more than 4% to close at slightly over $40 a barrel on the same day. China is now the biggest investor in Korean bonds, nudging the United States to second. According to the Korea Exchange, China owned nearly $15 billion worth of Korean bonds as of the end of February. The US held $12.3 billion. This is the first time China has been the largest holder of Korean bonds. Last month, foreign investors sold off $3.7 billion worth of Korean bonds to rebalance their investment portfolios amid market volatility. But Chinese investors decided to buy local bonds for future gains. Newly released figures by the International Monetary Fund rank Korea 6th in the world in terms of financial development. The assessment is in sharp contrast, however, to a different track record by the World Economic Forum based on surveys of businesses. Park Jong-hong reports.
The latest IMF index puts Korea high on the country list for overall financial health. This is based on a working paper by the International Monetary Fund released in January covering a broad range of financial indicators. The paper, which looked at 2013 data, noted that Korea ranked 6th in the world, behind Switzerland, Australia, Britain, the US, and Spain. The study observed the financial development trends of 183 countries, looking at three key factors: financial depth, access, and efficiency, and was measured by a score range of 0 to 1, with 1 being the highest possible level. Until recently, the IMF had used only the financial depth category to reflect the scale of a country's financial sector compared with the real economic activity. This is the first ever broad-based evaluation by the IMF, although it's not an official release. The subcategories of assessment included the portion of pension fund asset per GDP, return on assets, the aggregate value of listed stocks compared to the GDP, and so on. The Bank of Korea said Korea's Financial Development Index of 0.854 is far higher than the OECD average of 0.667. In particular, Korea ranked at number 1 for financial market efficiency, receiving the highest possible score of 1.0, which measured the turnover ratio of listed stock. These results are in stark contrast to an assessment made by the World Economic Forum last year. The WEF said Korea's national competitiveness ranked 26th in the world, and the financial market ranked 87th, behind countries like Uganda, which came in at 81st. But skeptics took issue with the objectivity of the ranking, as it was compiled with opinion surveys by businesses. While the latest report puts Korea ahead of the pack, a BOK official noted that the figures should not be overestimated, as they lack variables like financial innovation, diversity of service, and globalization. Park Jong-hong, Arirang News.
Now, the turnover rate for demand deposits by Koreans is falling, indicating that money circulation is clogged and adding to the debate on the central bank's monetary policy. According to the Bank of Korea, the deposit turnover rate in January stood at 21.2, and that's the lowest since February 2007. The average rate for last year was 24.3, lower than in 2008. When the country was hit by the global financial crisis. Now, a lower rate means fewer withdrawals, which shows that people are holding on to their money instead of spending it or investing it elsewhere. The latest figure is likely to heat up the debate over the BOK's monetary policy. The central bank has kept its base rate at 1.5% since last June and has expressed caution about another rate cut. The Korean government is stepping up efforts to cut carbon emissions by making investments in related technology. The Science Ministry says it plans to put up its budget by 10% from last year to $48.4 million. Now, the lion's share, almost $20 million, will be spent on the development of a kind of carbon dioxide capture technology. The ministry also plans to invest in the development of solar panels, fuel cells and the making of bioenergy fuel technology. Last year, the government announced plans to cut Korea's emissions levels by 37% by the year 2030. Now, FIFA is going to try and reclaim millions of dollars pocketed illegally by corrupt FIFA members and other football officials. A US-based probe exposed deeply ingrained corruption within and around football's world governing body, and FIFA estimates tens of millions of dollars were diverted from the sport through either bribery, kickbacks or corrupt schemes carried out by the defendants, including some very high-level people, former executives Jack Warner, Chuck Blazer and Jeffrey Webb. FIFA has submitted documents to the US authorities in an effort to get this cash back. Football's ruling body has admitted to bribes being taken as part of the bidding process for the 1998 World Cup in France and the 2010 World Cup in South Africa. Well, that's all we have for now. I'm Mark Broom. Thank you, as always, for watching. And if you're watching us in Korea, why don't you go outside and check out the extremely mild weather we're having today. It makes a nice change after a long winter. We'll be back throughout the day with more newscasts, of course. Next one coming up at 6 p.m. Korea time. So until then, goodbye.